On a day early in November of 1898, by the account most often repeated, a Swedish immigrant named Olof Öhman worked an axe around the base of a stunted poplar tree on his farm in Solem Township, Douglas County, Minnesota, clearing ground ahead of spring planting. He was 44 years old. He had left Forsa in the Swedish province of Hälsingland 17 years earlier and had owned this particular stretch of land for only 7 years. His 10-year-old son, Edward, worked beside him. The ground in Solem Township in late autumn is heavy and cold, cut through with wetland and low ridges of glacial till, and the particular knoll Öhman was clearing that day rose just high enough above the marsh to make it worth the trouble of pulling stumps before the frost set in. When the tree finally came loose, its roots dragging free of the soil in a tangled mass, something else came with it. Pinned flat beneath the roots, face down, was a slab of grey stone roughly 30 inches long, 16 inches wide, and 6 inches thick, weighing something close to 200 pounds. Edward noticed the markings first, rows of angular characters cut into the stone's face, and continuing along one edge, characters that resembled nothing either of them had ever seen carved on a tool, a gravestone, or a building anywhere in Douglas County. Öhman did not know what he was looking at. He would later say he thought it might be an old Indian almanac. He had no way of knowing that the object in his hands would still be argued over by professional linguists and geologists more than 100 years later, that his own name would end up printed in university journals on 2 continents, or that the argument would never fully close because the paper record around the discovery itself was never complete enough to let it close. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The stone itself is greywacke, a hard sedimentary rock, and the carving covers 9 lines across its broad face, with 3 more lines running down one narrow edge, and a small cross scratched near the top. Once transcribers worked through the runic characters, the inscription resolved into a short, specific account. 8 Goths and 22 Norwegians, it reads, were on a journey of exploration or acquisition from Vinland far to the west. They had made camp beside 2 rocky skerries, 1 day's journey north of the stone. They had gone out fishing for a day. When they returned to camp, they found 10 of their men, red with blood and dead. AVM, save us from evil, the inscription continues, the letters standing for Ave Virgo Maria, and it closes by noting that 10 more men had been left by the sea, watching the ships, 14 days' journey from where the stone was carved. Near the bottom, rendered through a runic numbering system known as pentadic numerals, is a date, 1362. The characters themselves are not uniform. Some resemble runic forms well attested in medieval Scandinavia. Others are unusual enough that early readers could not immediately place them in any known runic row, a detail that would matter a great deal, in opposite directions, to 2 different groups of investigators over the following century. If genuine, the stone would place an armed Scandinavian party inside the North American interior more than 130 years before Christopher Columbus reached the Caribbean, and roughly 3 centuries after the Norse settlement documented at Lanceau Meadows in Newfoundland had already been abandoned. It would mean 30 men had traveled from the Atlantic coast into what is now the middle of Minnesota by a route that has never been reconstructed with any confidence, and that 10 of them had died there, far from any coastline, in a killing serious enough to be carved into rock before the survivors turned for home. Öhman's neighbor, a Norwegian immigrant named Nils Flaten, walked over the same day the stone came out of the ground, and his later account matched Öhman's in nearly every detail: the tree, the depth, the tangle of roots, the moment the inscribed face turned upward in the dirt. Neither man swore to what he had seen until July 20th of 1909, nearly 11 years after the fact, when both filed formal affidavits before a Douglas County notary named R.J. Rasmussen. In the years between, nothing about the discovery was entered into any county register, land office record, or survey document anywhere in Douglas County. The stone existed first as a curiosity propped in the window of a bank in the town of Kensington, then as the subject of a letter from a local man, J.P. Hedberg, to a Swedish-American publisher in Minneapolis named Swan J. Turnblad, and then as a story that spread outward through Turnblad's paper, the Minneapolis Journal, and eventually the Chicago Tribune. Readers as far away as Chicago were, within a matter of weeks, reading about a 14th-century Scandinavian expedition into the American interior, while the man who had actually pulled the stone from the ground stayed on his farm in Solem Township and gave almost no interviews of his own. When the Minnesota Historical Society finally issued its own formal report on the case in 1910, that report gave the date of discovery as November 8th, not the single day in August that both Öhman and Flaten had sworn to under oath the year before, and it did not include the sworn affidavits at all. Two different official versions of when the stone came out of the ground exist in the historical record, produced 11 months apart by the same investigating body, and Douglas County itself never logged the find in any government document then or since. What happened to the stone once it left the farm is where the story becomes traceable through paper, and where the paper trail begins to work against the stone rather than for it. Hedberg's hand copy of the inscription was sent to the University of Minnesota in Minneapolis, where through a clerical error it landed first in the Greek department, and no one there could make sense of an alphabet that was not Greek. It reached Olaus J. Breda, a professor of Scandinavian languages who had held his position since 1884, in January of 1899. Breda's conclusion came quickly. He judged the inscription a clumsy, modern forgery, mixing Norwegian, Swedish, and English in a way no 14th-century document could, and he published that judgment in the university's student newspaper, Ariel, on January 14th, then again, in more detail, in Turnblad's own paper on February 22nd. He forwarded copies of the text to colleagues in Scandinavia, the philologists Olof Rig, Sophus Bugge, Gustav Storm, Magnus Olsson, and Adolf Noreen. They examined it independently and reached the same verdict, unanimously calling it a fraud and a forgery of recent date. Within weeks, the scholarly judgment on the Kensington stone was fraud, delivered almost entirely by men sitting in offices thousands of miles from Douglas County, working from a hand copy of the inscription rather than the object itself, a fact the stone's later defenders would return to again and again as a weakness in the case against it. In February of 1899, the actual stone was shipped east to George O. Curme, a linguist at Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois, where an amateur geologist named John Fletcher Stewart photographed it for the first time, the earliest photographic record of the inscription that survives. Curme's judgment matched Breda's. The stone came back to Minnesota in March of 1899, rejected by every institution that had examined it, and Öhman, by every surviving account, did not fight the verdict. He did not sue, did not go looking for more scholars, and did not sell the stone for the sums that were occasionally offered to him. According to several people who later visited the farm, he used the slab for a period of years as a stepping stone near his granary, laid face down, an object heavy enough to be useful and, as far as the professors of Minneapolis and Evanston were concerned, worth nothing else. That might have been the end of it, a rejected stone doing duty as a threshold on a Minnesota farm, if not for a visit in August of 1907 from a Norwegian-American writer named Hjalmar Holand, a former graduate student at the University of Wisconsin. Holand examined the stone at the farm and left with it for a payment of $10. What exactly changed hands that day was never entirely settled. For years afterward, there was disagreement about whether Öhman had sold his ownership outright or simply lent the stone to Holand for study, an ambiguity that mattered a great deal 3 years later, when Holand tried to sell the stone to the Minnesota Historical Society for $5,000, and Öhman blocked the sale, insisting the stone was still legally his. Holand spent the next 50 years of his life defending the stone's authenticity, regardless of who owned it, publishing 6 books on the subject, among them The Kensington Stone, a study in pre-Columbian history, and touring the lecture circuit, answering every academic dismissal with a fresh argument or a fresh piece of circumstantial evidence. He was, by the account of people who knew him, a capable and persuasive writer, and the case he built did not rest on language alone. It rested on geology, and it rested on doubt about the very people who had rejected it in the first place. The question of who actually controlled the stone would resurface as a legal dispute decades later, when 3 people and the heirs of 7 others who had once given Holand a sum of $2,500, believing it was purchase money for the stone, sued to establish ownership. Holand countered that the payment had been a scholarship, freely given to support his research abroad, with no claim on the object attached. In 1909 and 1910, the Minnesota Historical Society convened a committee to examine the stone, led by Newton H. Winchell, the state's first chief geologist, who had held that post from 1872 to 1900, and had spent decades surveying Minnesota's bedrock with a reputation for caution. Winchell studied the weathering inside the carved grooves, compared it to the weathering on the stone's unmarked back, which he took to be glacial in origin, and in a letter to the Society dated December 15, 1909, concluded that the inscription was not a modern forgery and had to be accepted as a genuine record of an exploration. For a scientist of his standing, it was a striking departure, and it split his colleagues. Professor Giselle Bothn of the University of Minnesota declined to take part in the committee's proceedings at all. Flom, a linguist at the University of Illinois, published his own analysis that same year, 1910, and gave it a title that answered Winchell before the reader had even opened it: The Kensington Runestone, a modern inscription from Douglas County, Minnesota. 2 respected scholars, working from the same object in the same year, reached opposite conclusions from 2 different disciplines, and neither discipline ever fully persuaded the other. Winchell held to his position until his death in 1914. The debate he had stepped into, one that most of his professional peers considered settled by 1900, became, almost without notice, the last major project of his career, and the geological argument he built was not picked up again in any serious way for close to 90 years. The tree itself became a piece of evidence in its own right, and an unreliable one. Winchell reported that the original tree had already been destroyed by 1910, so his team cut down several nearby poplars that witnesses judged comparable in size, and counted growth rings placing their age at somewhere between 30 and 40 years, meaning the tree that had grown over the stone likely took root before 1880, a year before Öhman had even left Sweden. If the count was accurate, and if the comparison trees were truly representative, Öhman could not have buried the stone himself, since he had not yet reached Minnesota when it would have needed to go into the ground. But Cleve Van Dyke, the Douglas County School superintendent who had visited the excavation site back in 1899, later recalled the tree from memory as being only 10 to 12 years old, less than a third of Winchell's figure. The surrounding township had not even been settled until 1858, and settlement nearby was slowed for years afterward by the Dakota War of 1862, which leaves a narrow and contested window for a tree of any real age to have grown over anything at all. No original growth ring sample from the actual felled tree survives to settle the question either way, and the comparison trees Winchell's team cut down in 1910 were themselves chosen nearly a full decade after the discovery, by witnesses working from memory of a tree that no longer existed. For the next 4 decades, Holland's advocacy built momentum that the professors of 1899 had not anticipated. The high point came in February of 1948, when the Smithsonian Institution put the Kensington stone on public display in Washington, D.C., where it stayed for about a year. The Smithsonian's own curators were careful with their language, presenting the stone as an object of wide public interest and unresolved scholarly debate, rather than a verified 14th-century artifact, and prominent runologists, including the Swede Sven Jansson in 1949 and the Dane Erik Moltke in 1953, published fresh rejections of its authenticity during and after the exhibition. The difference between an object worth exhibiting and an object confirmed as genuine was lost on a great many visitors, and it has stayed lost in the years since. Newspapers covering the exhibition described crowds gathering around a glass case in the nation's capital to look at a farm stone from Douglas County, Minnesota, most of them unaware that the institution displaying it had gone out of its way to avoid calling it real. On October 9, 1951, a group of 10 Alexandria businessmen purchased the stone outright for around $2,500, after it had spent time in the hands of the local Chamber of Commerce, and the town dedicated a park around a granite replica many times its original size. Öhman's discovery, once sent east to be dismissed by professors who had mostly seen a hand copy of it, came home to stay in Douglas County for good. The stone has not left the region since. It sits today in the Runestone Museum in Alexandria, a short drive from the farm where Öhman found it, displayed by the museum itself as a genuine 14th century artifact, a position the wider field of Scandinavian runology has not shared since Breda's first verdict in 1899. The land around Kensington produced one more twist in the story, decades later, that is worth sitting with, because it shows exactly how the original pattern can repeat itself even after everyone involved should have known better. In May of 2001, a stone carving specialist from Minneapolis named Janie Westin and her father Robert G. Johnson, an adjunct professor in the geology department at the University of Minnesota, were surveying boulders near Kensington Runestone Park as part of an organized scientific testing team formed to study the original stone. On a small island in a lake on the farm of Arlen and Ruby Sobolik, about a quarter-mile from Öhman's find site, Westin found the letters AVM carved into a lichen-covered granite boulder. 2 weeks later, working with the Minneapolis geologist Scott Walter, the team cleared away more lichen and found additional characters, the date 1363, 1 year after the Kensington stone, written in the same pentadic numerals, and a second line of 3 runes. The team called it new evidence supporting the original stone. Minnesota's state archaeologist, Mark Dudzik, was openly skeptical, noting that Bronze Age Scandinavians had no established history of penetrating this deep into a continental interior, and that the coincidence of a second stone appearing so conveniently, so close to the first, deserved more suspicion than celebration. His caution turned out to be justified. The team hauled the boulder, weighing something close to a ton, away from the lake island to a secure location, and brought in independent archaeologists to excavate the site properly, treating the find with the same seriousness Öhman's discovery had never received in 1898. The carvers eventually came forward. The AVM boulder had been cut by a group of local students in 1985, 16 years before Westin ever found it, as a private joke that outgrew itself once professional investigators started running scientific tests on a rock they had carved for fun. The very ground around the original find site, it turned out, could still produce a fresh hoax on demand more than a century after the first one. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The Kensington stone was not the first or the last runic inscription to surface in North America and split professional opinion along nearly identical lines. Near Heavener, Oklahoma, a single line of 8 runic characters cut into a sandstone bluff on Poteau Mountain had been known to local Choctaw hunters since at least the 1830s, who called it Indian Rock and left it alone. In 1923, the Smithsonian Institution examined a copy of the markings and confirmed they were Scandinavian in form. A Heavener resident named Gloria Farley saw the stone in 1928 as a teenager and spent most of the rest of her life researching it, eventually persuading the state of Oklahoma to open a park around the site in 1970. The inscription reads, Nomadal. It mixes runes from 2 different Scandinavian alphabets that were in use centuries apart, a combination that has never appeared together in any confirmed medieval Norse inscription, and it is that mixture, more than any single character, that has kept most professional runologists unconvinced. Henrik Williams, the same Uppsala runologist who would later examine the Kensington stone's disputed letters, voiced his own doubts about the Oklahoma stones in a public assessment in 2015. A second stone, found by schoolboys near Poto, Oklahoma, in 1967, carries a shorter inscription in a similar mixed alphabet, and an American researcher named Richard Nielsen, who spent years defending the Kensington stone as well, argued in the 1980s that both Oklahoma inscriptions were older than mainstream runologists believed. The pattern of defenders migrating from one contested stone to another, carrying the same arguments and the same skepticism toward institutional dismissal, runs through nearly every case in this field. In Phippsburg, Maine, on May 27, 1971, a carpenter named Walter J. Elliot found 3 small stones bearing runic inscriptions along the eroding bank of Spirit Pond, one of them carved with a rough map of the coastline. The Maine State Museum purchased the stones from Elliot for $4,500 in January of 1972 and asked Einar Haugen, a linguist at Harvard University, to examine them. Haugen's report, delivered that May, concluded the inscriptions were a hoax. In each of these 3 cases, Kensington, Heavener, and Spirit Pond, the same pattern appears, a discovery made by a private individual with no institutional standing, a fast and largely unfavorable judgment from professional linguists working from limited material, a smaller but determined community of defenders who kept the question alive for decades afterward, and an object that has never been subjected to the kind of exhaustive, repeatable, multi-laboratory analysis that gets applied automatically to an artifact of comparable claimed age, found under different circumstances, in a country with a longer institutional memory for its own antiquities. What has kept the Kensington case alive, in a way neither Heavener nor Spirit Pond has quite matched, is the sheer weight of physical evidence attached to it, evidence that geology and historical linguistics have never managed to reconcile with each other. The rock has been tested, the grooves have been measured, the tree has been counted, twice, with 2 different answers. The affidavits have been read and reread by 3 generations of researchers when they were included in the official record at all. And still the 2 disciplines best equipped to settle the question, geology on one side and Scandinavian philology on the other, keep arriving at opposite conclusions from the same slab of stone, as though they were examining 2 different objects rather than one. The genuine Norse settlement at Lonceau Meadows, confirmed by excavation in the 1960s and dated to roughly the year 1000, proves that Scandinavian sailors reached North America centuries before Columbus. It does not on its own prove or disprove that any of them, or their descendants, made it as far as the middle of Minnesota 360 years later, and the Kensington stone remains the only physical claim on that specific question that anyone has ever produced. The geological argument that Winchell had staked his final years on did not remain dormant forever. In the year 2000, Scott Walter, the same Minneapolis geologist who would later be called in to examine the AVM boulder, prepared thin sections from the inscribed grooves and from the unmarked surface of the Kensington stone through his firm, American Petrographic Services, and examined them under transmitted light. He found that mica within the greywacke had weathered into a clay mineral called cerussite to a comparable depth in both the carved and uncarved areas, a transformation he argued required a span of time measured in centuries rather than years, based on comparisons with dated tombstones in Hallowell, Maine, cut in the 1700s and 1800s. His conclusion was careful in its own way. He did not confirm the date of 1362, carved into the stone. He argued only that the inscription could not have been cut in 1898, and that whoever carved it had done so long before Öhman was born. His method drew immediate scrutiny of its own. Other geologists questioned whether cerussite formation could be dated with the precision Walter claimed, and whether the Hallowell tombstones he used as a comparison were carved from a stone similar enough to greywacke to make the comparison meaningful at all. A geologist named Dick Ojakangas, examining glacial striations on the back of the stone, found evidence consistent with the rock having been shaped by natural glacial movement long before any carving took place, a detail that speaks to the stone's deep geological history but says nothing about when the runes themselves were cut into its face. 4 years later, the linguistic case against the stone was rebuilt from an unexpected direction. Researchers at a dialect archive in Umeå in northern Sweden were reviewing personal papers that had belonged to a tailor named Edward Larsson, who lived from 1867 to 1950 in the Dalarna region of central Sweden. Among Larsson's papers were 2 documents, one written by his older brother in 1883 and a neater copy made by Larsson himself, both recording a secret runic alphabet and a system of numerals used by traveling tradesmen in 19th century Sweden, a trade code passed between journeymen rather than a language handed down from the medieval period. When Henrik Williams compared the Larsson documents to the disputed characters on the Kensington stone, several of the stone's most unusual and previously unexplained runes, including a dotted vowel form that had puzzled scholars for a century, matched the Larsson code almost exactly. Williams later said he had come close, at points in his career, to accepting the stone as genuine. The Larsson papers moved him back toward the conclusion Breda had reached in 1899 on entirely different grounds. If the code used to carve part of the inscription did not exist before the 1880s, the reasoning runs, the inscription cannot predate the 1880s either, no matter what the weathering on the surface appears to show. Defenders of the stone have pointed out, in response, that Larsson's own papers do not prove the code originated with him, only that he was the earliest person on record known to have written it down, which leaves open the possibility, unproven either way, that the code itself was older than any surviving document happens to show. Where that leaves the stone is close to where it has stood for most of its history, caught between 2 forms of evidence that were never built to be tested against one another. The weathering inside the carved grooves argues for age. The trade code used to cut some of those same grooves argues for a specific decade in the 1880s, within Öhman's own lifetime and within reach of a Scandinavian immigrant community that included tailors, farmers, and school teachers who moved between Sweden and Minnesota carrying exactly this kind of folk knowledge with them. No laboratory has yet reconciled those 2 findings into a single, agreed timeline, and the researchers working each side of the question, geologists on one side, runologists on the other, have continued for the most part to work inside their own disciplines rather than against each other's data directly. The stone survives all of it. It has survived a university committee in Minneapolis, a rejection from Northwestern, a state geologist's divided legacy, a year on display at the Smithsonian without the institution's own endorsement, a copycat hoax carved into a nearby boulder by bored teenagers, and more than a century of argument carried on almost entirely without the one document that might have settled part of it early, a contemporaneous, official record of the day it came out of the ground. Douglas County never logged the find. No surveyor was called to the site in 1898. No notary was present. No deed or land record anywhere in the county was annotated to reflect what had been dug out of a hillside in Solem Township, and by the time anyone thought to write it down under oath, 11 years had passed, and the county's own historical society could not even agree with its own witnesses about which month it happened in. Öhman died in 1935. Having spent 37 years answering questions about a single afternoon of clearing land, without ever once changing the basic details of his account. He never grew wealthy from the stone. He never left Solem Township. What exists today, in place of the clean official record that never got made, is the stone itself, a tree that is long gone, a pair of affidavits signed 11 years too late, a boulder-sized joke carved 100 yards from the original site, and a museum in Alexandria, Minnesota, a short drive from where a 44-year-old farmer once knelt in a half-cleared field with his 10-year-old son beside him. Visitors to that museum today can stand in front of the same slab of greywacke Öhman pulled from beneath a poplar's roots and read, translated onto a placard beside it, an account of 10 men found red with blood and dead, left there by whoever carved the words in whatever year they actually carved them, for reasons that no affidavit, no thin section of rock, and no dialect archive in Sweden has ever fully explained. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.